titled The Whispering Tree. The rain came down in heavy sheets, hammering against the windows of the old farmhouse. The wind howled and the trees swayed wildly in the storm. Inside, Claire sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the flickering candle on the table. Her flashlight had died hours ago, and the power had gone out not long after. She was house-sitting for a friend, Laura, who had begged her to stay in the farmhouse for a few days while she was away on a trip. Claire had agreed, thinking it would be a peaceful getaway from her hectic life in the city. The farmhouse was isolated, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. At first, the solitude had been comforting. But tonight, with the storm raging outside and the ancient house creaking with every gust of wind, Claire felt a growing sense of unease. As she stared at the candle, she heard it again, a faint whisper, so quiet she almost thought it was her imagination. She froze, listening intently. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the window. She turned her head slowly, the rain-soaked glass distorting the dark shapes outside, and then she heard it more clearly, a distinct whisper that sent chills down her spine. Claire. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up straight, her heart racing. She tried to tell herself it was the wind, just the wind, but the voice sounded so human, so close. Claire! It came again, and this time she was certain it was coming from outside. She stood up, slowly approaching the window. The rain made it hard to see, but she thought she could make out a figure standing beneath the large oak tree at the edge of the yard. The tree was ancient, its gnarled branches reaching up like skeletal hands. Claire squinted, trying to get a better look, but the darkness was thick, almost suffocating. Then the lightning flashed, and for a brief moment she saw him. A man standing under the tree, his face pale, eyes wide and staring directly at her. She gasped and stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. When the lightning faded, he was gone. Claire's mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Had she really seen someone, or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be, not out here. She cursed under her breath. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something to defend herself with, just in case. She found an old fireplace poker, rusted but solid, and gripped it tightly as she crept toward the front door. She felt foolish, but the urge to confirm that she was alone was stronger than her fear. She opened the door, and the storm assaulted her immediately. Rain lashed her face, and the wind whipped her hair around her head. She could barely see more than a few feet in front of her. Slowly, she made her way toward the oak tree. Her footsteps squelched in the mud, and the rain drenched her clothes. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it were right beside her. Claire. She spun around, but no one was there. Her grip tightened on the poker, and she continued toward the tree. As she drew closer, she noticed something odd. The ground beneath the tree seemed dry, untouched by the rain. Her heart beat faster. She looked up at the tree, and her breath caught in her throat. Hanging from one of the lower branches was a rope, frayed and old, swinging back and forth in the wind. It looked like a noose. Claire's blood ran cold. She took a step back, and that's when she saw it. The fresh dirt at the base of the tree, as if something had recently been buried. Her mind raced with 100 thoughts. Had Laura mentioned anything about this? No, there had been no mention of anything strange. But then again, Laura had been acting odd before she left, hadn't she? Jumpy, nervous. Claire felt a pang of fear. What had Laura gotten her into? Claire? The whisper was right in her ear now, and she whirled around, swinging the poker wildly. But there was nothing, just the rain and the wind. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the tree, her eyes never leaving the fresh mound of earth. She needed to get back inside, needed to call someone. Anyone. But as she turned, the lightning flashed again, and she saw the figure standing in the doorway of the farmhouse. Her heart stopped. It was the man she had seen before. His face twisted in a grotesque smile. His eyes were hollow, black holes in the pale moonlight. Claire screamed and ran toward the house, slipping and stumbling in the mud. When she reached the doorway, he was gone. She rushed inside and slammed the door shut, bolting it. Her hands were shaking, and she was drenched to the bone. She backed away from the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to find something, anything to defend herself. Then she noticed the wet footprints on the floor. Her heart sank as she realized they led from the doorway to the basement. "Claire." The whisper came again, from beneath her feet this time. She stared at the door leading to the basement, her heart pounding louder than the storm outside. She had to know. She had to see for herself. Slowly, she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She turned it and pulled the door open, the rusty hinges creaking loudly. Darkness yawned before her, a thick, suffocating blackness. She took a deep breath and descended the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. At the bottom, she saw him, standing there in the center of the room. The same man with the same hollow eyes and twisted smile. He raised a hand, pointing at a corner of the basement. Claire followed his gesture, and her eyes widened in horror. There in the corner was Laura, tied to a chair, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Her mouth was covered with duct tape, and tears streamed down her face. Claire rushed to her, pulling the tape away. "Claire, run," Laura whispered frantically. "He's not real. He's—" But before she could finish, the figure began to move toward them, his smile growing wider, his body flickering like a dying light bulb. And then Claire understood. The man was not alive. He was a ghost, a shadow, something that did not belong in this world. The whisper came again, louder, echoing in the small basement. "Claire." And then, with a sudden rush of cold air, the candle blew out, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness, the whisper came one final time, right next to her ear. "You're mine now." And the door slammed shut. When the search party found the farmhouse the next day, they discovered the door to the basement wide open, but Claire and Laura were never found. The only sign that they had ever been there was a single word, scratched into the wooden beam above the basement door with a rusted nail. "Run." Title: The Dollmaker's Curse. The rain pattered against the roof of the old Victorian house as Emma stepped through the front door. The air was thick with dust, and a faint musty smell lingered, mixing with the scent of wet earth from outside. The house belonged to her late Aunt Margaret, a woman she barely remembered. After Margaret's passing, Emma had inherited the property, and now she was here to sort through the belongings and decide what to keep, sell, or discard. The house was dark, with heavy curtains drawn over every window. Emma clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The furniture was covered with white sheets, and the old wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. There was an unnatural coldness in the air, as if the house had been waiting for her. Her footsteps echoed as she moved through the rooms, each one filled with remnants of a life long forgotten. Strange paintings lined the walls, images of dolls with wide, unblinking eyes staring down at her. She paused at one of them, feeling a chill run down her spine. The doll in the painting seemed almost lifelike, its glassy eyes following her as she moved. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the creeping sense of unease. This was just an old house, filled with old things, nothing more. But she couldn't ignore the prickling sensation at the back of her neck, like she was being watched. Emma made her way to the attic, where Margaret's most personal belongings were stored. The narrow stairs creaked with each step, and the air grew colder the higher she climbed. When she reached the top, she paused. The attic door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The attic was cluttered, filled with old trunks, boxes, and covered furniture. But what caught her attention immediately was the row of dolls sitting on a shelf along the far wall. There were dozens of them, all different sizes and styles, but all with the same unnervingly realistic eyes. Emma frowned. She had never liked dolls, especially not these kinds, old, porcelain, with eyes that seemed to see too much. She approached the shelf, her flashlight beam dancing over their faces. Some of the dolls were smiling, others had expressions of sadness or anger. One in particular caught her eye, a large doll in the center, dressed in a Victorian-style gown, its eyes blue and piercing. She reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the doll's face. The porcelain was cold, almost too cold. As her fingers brushed against its cheek, she heard a faint noise like a whisper. Startled, she pulled her hand back and turned around. The attic was silent. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind, just her imagination. But then she heard it again, a soft, breathy whisper, so quiet she almost missed it. Emma, her heart stopped. She turned back to the shelf, staring at the dolls. None of them had moved, but she could have sworn the large doll's head had turned ever so slightly. Her pulse quickened as she backed away slowly, her flashlight beam trembling. She laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "It's just a doll, an old, creepy doll in an old, creepy house." But the whisper came again, louder this time, and she was certain it was coming from the large doll. "Emma." She froze. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. She needed to get out of here, needed to leave this house. She turned and hurried back down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. As she reached the bottom, she heard a soft creaking noise from the attic. She glanced back up, and her blood ran cold. The door, which she had left open, was slowly closing on its own. Emma didn't wait to see what would happen next. She rushed into the living room, grabbed her bag, and headed for the front door. But when she reached it, she found it locked. She fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled and yanked, her panic growing, but it was as if the door had sealed itself shut. "Emma?" The whisper came again, this time from behind her. She spun around, and her heart nearly stopped. The large doll was now at the bottom of the stairs, sitting there with its blue eyes fixed on her, its head tilted slightly to the side. How did you?" she stammered, backing away. The doll's mouth moved. "Emma." Emma's scream caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, tripping over the rug and falling hard onto the floor. The doll began to move, its tiny porcelain hands reaching out, its legs bending at unnatural angles as it crawled toward her. No, this isn't happening," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. She bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. She glanced back over her shoulder, and the doll was closer now, dragging itself along the floor, its mouth forming a twisted smile. She burst into the kitchen, searching frantically for something, anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and held it up, her hands shaking. The doll stopped just outside the kitchen doorway, its smile widening. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma," it whispered in a voice that was no longer soft, but sharp and cold. Emma swung the skillet, but the doll moved with surprising speed, dodging the blow. It laughed, a high, unnatural sound that sent chills down her spine. She swung again and again, but each time the doll seemed to anticipate her movements, dancing just out of reach. Suddenly, it lunged at her, and Emma stumbled backward, her back slamming against the wall. She felt a sharp pain in her side, and her hand instinctively moved to her pocket, where something sharp had jabbed her. Her fingers closed around a small, jagged key. The doll stopped, its eyes narrowing. "No," it hissed. "You can't." Emma didn't wait to hear the rest. She pulled out the key and turned to the door at the end of the hallway, the door to the basement. She had no idea why, but something deep inside her told her the answer was down there. She unlocked the door and rushed down the stairs, slamming it shut behind her. The basement was dark and damp, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. She pulled the chain and the light flickered on. In the corner of the room, she saw a small wooden box covered in dust. She approached it slowly, the doll's whispers growing louder behind the door. Her hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound journal. She flipped it open, skimming through the pages filled with drawings of dolls, notes, and spells. Her aunt's handwriting covered every inch of the paper. One entry caught her eye, dated only a month before her aunt's death. "I tried to break the curse, but it only grew stronger. The doll, it wants someone. It wants family." Emma's title, "The Mirror in the Attic." Rain battered the roof of the old cabin, a rhythmic drumming that filled the room. Sarah sat alone by the fire, her nerves on edge. She hadn't planned to stay in her late grandmother's cabin for more than a few hours, but the storm had grown so violent she couldn't leave. The wind howled outside, the trees bending and groaning under its force. Sarah had always felt uneasy in this place. As a child, she'd only visited a few times. Her grandmother had been a strange woman, always keeping to herself, with a house full of peculiar objects that seemed to whisper secrets in the dead of night. After her grandmother's death, the cabin had remained empty, forgotten. Now Sarah was here to sort through the belongings and see if there was anything worth keeping before the property was sold. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The cabin was filled with strange old furniture, heavy and dark, with the air thick with the smell of dust and wood smoke. As she looked around, her gaze settled on a narrow door in the corner of the room. It led to the attic, a place she had never been. She hesitated, feeling a strange pull. She didn't want to go up there. She knew the stories, how her grandmother had spent hours up there talking to herself as if she were never truly alone. But something urged her forward, a morbid curiosity she couldn't resist. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the door. The hinges squealed as she pushed it open, revealing a steep staircase. She shined the light upward and took a deep breath before climbing the narrow steps. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, musty smell filled her nose. At the top of the stairs, she pushed open another door and stepped into the attic. It was larger than she expected, with a low, slanted ceiling and wooden beams stretching across the room. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, and old trunks and boxes were piled high against the walls. But what drew her attention was the large antique mirror standing against the far wall. It was beautiful and haunting, with an ornate wooden frame carved with strange twisting shapes. The glass was old, slightly fogged, but still clear enough to see her reflection. She stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. There was something off about the mirror, something that made her heart quicken. As she approached, she noticed something odd. Her reflection seemed delayed. When she lifted her hand, the reflection hesitated before mimicking the movement, like a film playing just a fraction of a second too late. Her brow furrowed, and she leaned closer, examining the glass. She raised her hand again, waving it slowly. Her reflection stared back at her, and then, as if realizing it had been caught, it blinked. Just once, deliberately. Sarah gasped and stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her grip, her heart pounded in her chest. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, the old glass playing with her vision. But then, the reflection smiled. Not a normal smile, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, exposing teeth that seemed sharp and pointed. Sarah felt a wave of cold fear wash over her. She backed away, but her reflection didn't move. It remained there, staring at her with that eerie smile. She wanted to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The mirror seemed to draw her in, pulling at her, whispering to her without words. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to settle over her mind. She needed to get out, needed to leave this attic, this cabin. But the reflection's mouth moved, and a faint voice, like a distant echo, filled the room. "Stay." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had to move, had to get out, but her body felt disconnected, as if her limbs were no longer hers. The reflection began to change. Its eyes darkened, the skin grew pale, almost translucent, and its smile faded into a look of sadness, pleading. "Stay. With me." The voice was louder now, clearer. It was coming from the mirror, but also from behind her. She turned her head quickly, the flashlight swinging across the room. There was no one there. The room was empty, except for the old trunks and the shadows dancing on the walls. But she could feel it, a presence, something cold and heavy, like an invisible hand pressing down on her. She turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was normal again, but something was different. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. Her reflection's eyes were her eyes, but they seemed to shimmer, almost like they were filled with tears. And then suddenly her reflection mouthed a single word. "Run." Sarah's eyes widened. Her heart was thundering now, panic rising in her throat. The attic seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening, closing in around her. The air was thick, heavy, making it hard to breathe. The reflection spoke again, louder, more urgent. "Run! Now!" Without thinking, Sarah turned and ran toward the stairs. But as she reached the top step, she froze. The door was closed. She was sure she had left it open. She grabbed the handle and twisted it, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic rising. She could hear the voice behind her now, clearer, closer. "Sarah, don't go. Stay with me." She pounded on the door, desperation taking over. "Let me out! Please, let me out!" she screamed. The voice grew louder, almost angry. "No, don't leave me." Suddenly, the door swung open, and Sarah stumbled through, tumbling down the stairs. She hit the floor hard, pain shooting through her side. Now she scrambled to her feet and slammed the attic door shut behind her, breathing heavily. But the voice came again, muffled now, but still clear, still desperate. "Sarah, come back." She backed away from the door, her heart racing. She needed to get out, needed to leave this cabin, but as she turned to head for the front door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the hallway mirror, her reflection was still standing in the attic, staring back at her, pounding on the glass with frantic, terrified eyes. Sarah blinked, her mind reeling. She looked at her hands, her own hands in front of her, but the reflection wasn't hers. It was trapped, stuck behind the glass, pleading silently. The reflection mouthed one final word: help. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, replaced by the empty, silent attic. Sarah felt a scream rising in her throat, but she choked it down. She didn't know what had just happened, didn't understand. All she knew was that she needed to leave, needed to get out of this house, away from this place. But as she reached for the front door, she heard a creak from behind her. The attic door was slowly swinging open, a dark, yawning void beyond. And from that darkness, she heard her own voice, clear and steady, calling out, "Sarah, come back, please." Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. She wanted to run, to leave, to never look back. But something inside her, something deep and primal, told her she needed to go back, to face whatever was in that attic, to confront it. She turned, slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was closer now, clearer, as if it were right next to her ear. "Come back. Stay with me." And with a deep breath, against every instinct screaming at her to run, Sarah stepped back toward the stairs, toward the attic, and into the waiting darkness. The front door slammed shut behind her, and the rain began to fall harder. Title: The Last Guest. The rain fell relentlessly, turning the narrow country road into a muddy, treacherous path. It was the kind of night that made the world feel isolated and oppressive. Emma, huddled under her umbrella, trudged up to the old inn, a relic from another era. The sign hanging above the door creaked in the wind, its faded letters reading Ravenswood Inn. She had been driving for hours, her car having broken down miles back. The inn was the only sign of civilization for miles, and she had no choice but to seek refuge here. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a gust of cold wind swept past her, making her shiver. Inside, the inn was dimly lit by a few flickering lamps. The warmth was a welcome relief, but the inn had an eerie feel to it, as if it hadn't seen many guests in years. A large fireplace crackled on one side of the room, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The innkeeper, a gaunt man with a thin mustache, looked up from behind the reception desk. "Good evening," he said in a voice that was smooth but carried an unsettling edge. "How can I help you?" "I'm sorry to intrude," Emma said, rubbing her arms to warm up. "My car broke down, and I need a place to stay for the night." The innkeeper's eyes flickered with a strange light, but he nodded and handed her a key. "Room 7. It's on the second floor. Dinner is served at 7 if you'd like to join us." "Thank you," Emma said, taking the key and heading up the creaking stairs. The hallway on the second floor was narrow and dark, with only a few dim lights hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. When she reached room 7, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small but quaint, with antique furnishings and a large 4-poster bed. A single window overlooked the darkened landscape outside. She unpacked her things and then decided to head downstairs for dinner. The dining area was small, with only a few tables set up. The same dim lighting gave the room an almost claustrophobic feel. Emma took a seat at a table near the fireplace, and soon the innkeeper appeared with a tray of food. He set it down without saying a word and then retreated back into the shadows. As she ate, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence in the dining room was thick, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind against the windows. The food was surprisingly good, but Emma's mind was preoccupied with thoughts of her broken-down car and the strange atmosphere of the inn. Halfway through her meal, the door to the dining room creaked open, and a man walked in. He was tall and well-dressed, with a refined air about him. His appearance seemed out of place in the old inn. He glanced around, his eyes meeting Emma's for a brief moment before he took a seat at a table across the room. Emma watched him curiously. The man seemed oddly familiar, but she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. He nodded politely at her, and then turned his attention to the innkeeper, who brought him a drink. They exchanged a few words, and then the man sat in silence, staring at the fire. After finishing her meal, Emma decided to retire for the night. She climbed the stairs again, her mind racing with thoughts of the mysterious guest. As she reached her room, she noticed that room 8, right next to hers, had its door slightly ajar. A soft light spilled out into the hallway. Curiosity getting the better of her, Emma peered inside. The room was empty, but there was an old ornate mirror hanging on the wall. It seemed oddly out of place in the otherwise unremarkable room. She felt a chill run down her spine and quickly turned away, heading back to her own room. That night, as she lay in bed, she could hear the rain pounding against the window and the occasional creak of the unsettling. The strange feeling of being watched persisted, and she found herself unable to sleep. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. Suddenly, there was a knock on her door. Emma sat up, her heart racing. She had been alone in the inn all night, except for the other guest and the innkeeper. She hesitated before getting up and opening the door. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Emma frowned and closed the door, but the knocking came again, this time from the room next door. She tiptoed over and pushed the door to room 8 open. The room was dark, but the mirror still cast a faint, eerie light. The knocking continued, coming from inside the room. Emma moved toward the mirror, her flashlight beam trembling. As she approached, she noticed something odd. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. It was a split second behind her movements, as if it were an old film reel struggling to keep up. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. Emma's gaze was drawn to the mirror. In the dim reflection, she saw the tall man from earlier. His face was twisted in a look of terror, and he seemed to be reaching out from behind the glass. The image flickered, showing glimpses of a dark, oppressive void beyond the mirror's surface. "Help me," the man's reflection mouthed, though no sound came through. Emma's heart pounded as she stumbled back, her mind racing. The knocking stopped abruptly. She turned to leave, but felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there. The air was colder now, and the room felt as though it were closing in on her. In a flash of clarity, Emma realized the mirror was more than just a reflection. It was a gateway, a portal to something else, something dark and malevolent. The man's terrified face had been a warning, a cry for help from someone trapped inside. She ran out of the room, down the hallway, and back to her own room. She locked the door behind her and sat on the bed, trying to calm her racing heart. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a beast. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds of the inn grew louder, footsteps echoing in the hallway, soft whispers, and the occasional groan of the building. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had seen. She wanted to leave, to escape, but the storm made it impossible to venture out into the night. Just as she began to drift off, exhausted, there was another knock, this time from the door of her own room. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She listened, her heart pounding. The knock came again, more insistent. She slowly approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She took a deep breath and opened it. The hallway was empty, but there was a note on the floor, the edges damp from the rain. Emma picked it up, her hands shaking. The note was handwritten in an elegant script. "Welcome, dear guest. We've been expecting you. The last guest always stays with us forever." Emma's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The inn was not just an old, forgotten place. It was a trap, designed to keep souls imprisoned, forever bound to its dark, twisted realm. The air grew colder and the whispers grew louder. Emma turned and saw her own reflection in the mirror hanging in her room. It was not her own face staring back, but the faces of countless. Title: The Last Train Home. The rain fell in relentless sheets, pounding the old railway station with an almost rhythmic persistence. The station was deserted except for a few scattered benches and a flickering overhead light that cast eerie shadows across the platform. Emma stood beneath the shelter, peering into the darkness, hoping for a train to appear. She had missed the last scheduled train, and with her phone dead, she was left with no way to contact anyone. The station was old, its walls lined with peeling paint and faded advertisements for services long discontinued. Emma shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her, and glanced at the old-fashioned clock on the wall. It was well past midnight, and she was beginning to feel a gnawing sense of unease. The distant rumble of thunder made her jump, and she looked up to see the sky illuminated by a flash of lightning. The platform was now a grim, shadowy landscape, with only the occasional gust of wind and the rhythmic drumming of the rain for company. A sudden, sharp whistle pierced the air, followed by the screech of brakes. Emma's heart leaped with hope. She turned to see the headlights of a train cutting through the darkness, its engine roaring as it approached the platform. It was an old-fashioned locomotive, much older than the ones she was used to. Its paint was chipped and worn, and the steam hissing from the engine created a ghostly mist around it. The train slowed to a stop in front of her, and the door to one of the passenger cars slid open with a heavy clunk. A conductor, dressed in a faded uniform, stepped out and nodded at Emma. "Evening, miss." "Heading home?" Emma blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Yes, I'm trying to get home. Is this the last train?" The conductor's eyes, shadowed by his cap, looked vacant, as if he were staring through her rather than at her. "Last train of the night," he said, his voice oddly mechanical. Emma hesitated. Something about the train and the conductor unsettled her, but the thought of being stranded in the station all night was far worse. She nodded and stepped aboard. The interior of the train was dimly lit, with old-fashioned plush seats and wooden paneling. The air was cool, almost musty, and the silence inside was oppressive. Emma chose a seat near the window and sat down, trying to ignore the shiver running down her spine. The train lurched forward, its wheels clattering on the tracks. As the train picked up speed, Emma glanced out the window, watching the rain-drenched landscape slip by. The visibility was poor, and the darkness outside was nearly absolute. She leaned back in her seat, trying to relax, but the unease lingered. The lights flickered once, then twice, before settling into a steady glow. Emma tried to ignore the strange creaking sounds coming from somewhere in the train, but they were impossible to miss. The sound was almost like someone walking slowly down the aisle, though she could see no one. A few stations later, the train stopped with a jolt, and Emma looked up to see another passenger car attached. The new car was empty, its seats covered in dust as if it hadn't been used in years. The door to the new car closed behind her with a resounding click, sealing it off from the rest of the train. Emma's unease grew. She stood up and walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She passed by the empty car, her eyes scanning the seats for any sign of life. The car felt colder, the air more oppressive. She tried to ignore the sense of dread settling in her chest. As she reached the end of the car, she saw a small door leading to the conductor's compartment. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light shone through the crack. She hesitated, then knocked gently on the door. There was no response. She pushed the door open and peered inside. The compartment was dark, illuminated only by a single dim light bulb. The walls were lined with old maps and faded schedules. The conductor sat behind the desk, his back turned to her. "Excuse me," Emma said, her voice wavering. "I was wondering where we're headed. I don't recognize any of the stops." The conductor turned slowly, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes were hollow, devoid of any emotion. "This is the last train," he said softly. "There's nowhere else to go." Emma's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? This is the last train home, right?" The conductor's lips curled into a faint, eerie smile. "Home? We're not going to your home. We're going to the end of the line." Emma took a step back, her heart racing. "What do you mean? Where are we going?" The conductor's smile widened, and he gestured toward the window. Emma turned and looked out. The rain had stopped, but the landscape outside had changed. The familiar scenery had been replaced by an endless, mist-shrouded forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The train picked up speed, the scenery outside becoming a blur of dark shapes and shadows. Emma's anxiety turned to panic as she realized she had no idea where she was or how to escape. She stumbled back to her seat, trying to calm herself. The train's interior seemed to grow colder, and the air was filled with a low, mournful wail. The lights flickered again, and the air was filled with the faint, echoing sound of footsteps. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the car, and the lights went out. Emma was plunged into darkness, her breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the train and the eerie wail that seemed to come from all around her. In the darkness, she felt a presence, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on her. She could hear faint whispers, like a crowd of people talking just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Emma could make out words. "Welcome to the end of the line." The lights flickered back on, revealing the passengers. They were not ordinary people. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes empty voids. They stared at Emma with blank expressions, their eyes following her every move. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak. The train continued to speed through the endless forest, the landscape outside now a dark, oppressive void. The passengers around her began to shift, their movements jerky and unnatural. The train screeched to a halt, and the lights went out again. Emma could hear the sound of the conductor's footsteps approaching. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the air was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The lights flickered back on, and Emma saw the conductor standing in the aisle, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. "The end of the line," he said softly. "You're here forever." The train began to move again, but it was no longer on tracks. It floated in a dark, formless void, the landscape outside now a swirling, shifting mass of shadows. Emma's screams were swallowed by the darkness as the train plunged deeper into the abyss. The last thing she saw was the conductor's eyes, empty, hollow, and unblinking, before the darkness closed in and the train disappeared into the void. The next morning, the railway station was empty once more. The old-fashioned clock on the wall ticked away, its hands frozen at midnight. The platform was silent, the rain having finally ceased. The only sign of Emma's presence was a single ticket lying on the floor, its edges damp from the rain. The ticket was old, faded, and stamped with a single word, "Final." The station remained deserted, its secrets hidden in the darkness, waiting for the next traveler to arrive at the end of the line. The Whispering Rain. It was one of those nights when the rain didn't merely fall, but thrashed against the earth as if driven by some unseen rage. The small town of Hartwell had settled into the familiar rhythm of a stormy night, with its residents tucked away in their homes, seeking solace in the warmth and light within, except for one. Clara Dalton sat alone in her old Victorian house, its wooden walls creaking under the relentless wind. She had lived there all her life, inheriting the house from her grandmother, who had passed away a decade ago. The house was old, almost as old as the town itself, and it had a history that Clara had tried to forget. But tonight, the rain brought it all back. As the night deepened, Clara found herself drawn to the attic, a place she hadn't visited in years. The rain pounded on the roof, creating a symphony of noise that seemed almost hypnotic. With a lantern in hand, she climbed the narrow, winding staircase, her steps echoing in the stillness of the house. The door to the attic creaked open, revealing a space filled with forgotten memories. Dust-covered furniture, old trunks and boxes lined the walls, remnants of a bygone era. But there was one thing that Clara was looking for, a small, ornate box that had once belonged to her grandmother. She found it tucked away in a corner, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. The box was made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols that Clara couldn't understand. It had always intrigued her, even as a child, but her grandmother had warned her never to open it. "Some things are better left undisturbed," she had said, her voice filled with an emotion Clara had never fully understood. But tonight, something compelled Clara to break that promise. Perhaps it was the rain, or the loneliness, or the strange pull that the box seemed to have on her. With trembling hands, she opened the lid. Inside, she found a collection of yellowed papers, tied together with a faded red ribbon. As she untied the ribbon, the papers unfolded, revealing a diary, her grandmother's diary. The writing was neat and delicate, but there was a sense of urgency in the words, as if they had been written in haste. The first few entries were mundane, detailing everyday life in Hartwell. But as Clara read on, the tone changed. Her grandmother wrote of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, and a presence that she could not see but could feel, always watching, always waiting. One entry, dated exactly 50 years ago to the night, caught Clara's eye. The rain has started again. It always happens on nights like this when the sky opens up and the earth trembles. The whispers are louder tonight, and I can feel them getting closer. They want something. No, someone. I've tried to keep it at bay, but I fear I am not strong enough. If you are reading this, Clara, you must be careful. The house, it is not what it seems. There are secrets here, dark and terrible secrets, and they are coming for you. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she read the final line. She dropped the diary as if it had burned her, and the sound of it hitting the floor was swallowed by a sudden, deafening silence. The rain had stopped. In the stillness, Clara heard it, a whisper, so faint that she might have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, a soft voice calling her name. She turned towards the sound, her lantern casting long shadows across the room. At first, she saw nothing, but then her eyes were drawn to the far corner of the attic, where the shadows seemed to shift and swirl. A figure emerged, slowly taking shape in the darkness. It was her grandmother, or at least it looked like her. But there was something wrong, something terribly wrong. The figure's eyes were empty, hollow, and its face twisted in a grotesque parody of a smile. "Clara," it whispered, the voice raspy and distorted, "you shouldn't have opened the box." Clara stumbled backward, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a nightmare brought on by the storm. But the figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, its eyes locked on hers. She could feel the air around her growing colder, the shadows closing in. Desperately, Clara turned to run, but the attic door slammed shut before she could reach it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with a cacophony of voices. They spoke of darkness, of secrets long buried, of a curse that had plagued her family for generations. And then, amidst the chaos, one voice cut through, clear and sharp. "You can't escape, Clara. It's your turn now." Suddenly she remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell. Stories of a pact made long ago. A pact that had saved the family, but at a terrible cost. Every 50 years, one of them had to be taken, claimed by the darkness that lived within the house. Her grandmother had been the last, and now it was her turn. As the realization hit her, the figure lunged and the lantern fell from Clara's hand, plunging the attic into darkness. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. The whispers enveloped her, pulling her down into the cold, unrelenting blackness. The rain began again, soft at first, then growing louder, pounding against the roof with renewed fury. But inside the house there was only silence. When the townsfolk found the house the next morning, the attic was empty. There was no sign of Clara, only the open box and the diary lying on the floor, its pages fluttering in the breeze. The townspeople whispered among themselves, but none dared to speak of what they suspected. For they all knew the stories, the true horror that lurked within the old house on the hill. And as they left, one by one, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of Clara Dalton. But the whispers remained, waiting for the next stormy night. Hush! The dollhouse. The rain drummed against the windows of the small, isolated cabin, each droplet like a persistent tap on the glass. Emily had rented the cabin for a weekend retreat, seeking solitude and a break from her hectic life in the city. It was supposed to be a time for reflection, a chance to unwind, but as the storm outside intensified, she found herself feeling anything but relaxed. The cabin was old, the kind of place that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. It had belonged to an elderly couple who had passed away years ago, and their children had since rented it out to city folk looking for a rustic escape. The decor was quaint, with antique furniture and worn rugs, but what caught Emily's attention the moment she arrived was the dollhouse in the corner of the living room. It was a beautifully crafted replica of the cabin itself, detailed down to the last shingle on the roof and the smallest piece of furniture inside. The dolls within it were similarly intricate, dressed in tiny clothes and posed in various rooms. There was something eerie about it, but Emily dismissed the feeling as nothing more than her nerves. The first night passed uneventfully, though Emily couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. She had attributed it to the isolation of the cabin, the way the forest seemed to close in around the small building. But by the second night, as the storm outside grew more violent, she began to notice strange things. It started with the lights. As she was reading by the fire, the lamps flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness before snapping back to life. At first, she thought it was the storm, but then it happened again, and again. Each time, the flicker lasted just a bit longer. Uneasy, Emily put down her book and glanced at the dollhouse. It looked just as it had when she arrived, but something about it seemed different. She approached it cautiously, her eyes scanning the tiny rooms. Everything was in its place, except for one thing. The dolls had moved. She was certain of it. When she first arrived, they had been sitting in the living room, gathered around a miniature fireplace. But now, 2 of them were in the bedroom upstairs, and 1 was in the kitchen. Emily frowned, her heart beginning to race. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe she hadn't been paying attention before. But as she reached out to touch one of the dolls, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for several long seconds. When the lights came back on, Emily gasped. The doll she had been about to touch was no longer where it had been. It was now standing in the hallway of the dollhouse, facing the front door, as if it were about to leave. Emily stumbled back, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. This had to be a trick, some kind of illusion, but it felt too real. She decided to ignore the dollhouse, convincing herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. She locked herself in the bedroom, trying to calm her nerves. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wounded animal, and the rain hammered against the cabin with a fury that seemed almost unnatural. As she lay in bed, she could hear the creaks and groans of the old building, the kind of sounds that normally wouldn't bother her, but now felt ominous. Sleep was elusive, her mind filled with the unsettling image of the dolls moving on their own. Around midnight, Emily was startled awake by a loud bang from downstairs. Her heart pounded as she strained to listen, but all she could hear was the storm. Gathering her courage, she crept out of bed and opened the door a crack. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. She hesitated, considering just locking the door and waiting until morning. But something urged her forward, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the need to confirm that there was nothing to be afraid of. Slowly, she descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the bottom, she noticed that the dollhouse was now directly in front of the door, even though she had left it in the corner of the living room. The front door of the dollhouse was open, and the dolls were gone. Panic gripped her. Emily backed away, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the dolls, but there was nothing, only the relentless sound of the storm and the oppressive silence of the cabin. Just as she turned to run back upstairs, she felt something brush against her ankle. She looked down and saw one of the dolls lying on its side at her feet. Its tiny porcelain face was turned up towards her, its painted eyes wide and staring. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Emily saw the other dolls scattered across the floor, all facing her, as if they had been flung there by some unseen force. The lights flickered one last time and then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she fumbled for her phone, the only source of light she had left. But as she turned it on, she froze. The beam of her phone's light fell on the largest of the dolls, a doll that had not been there before. It was almost as tall as her knee, dressed in a faded white dress with lace trim, but it was the face that sent chills down her spine. The doll's face was an exact replica of her own. She stumbled back, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her, its painted lips curling into a smile. And then, slowly, it began to move. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Emily turned and fled up the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps as she raced to the bedroom. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her chest heaving with fear. But she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be enough. From the darkness outside the door, she heard the creak of tiny footsteps on the wooden floorboards getting closer and closer. The doorknob rattled as if something was trying to turn it, and then the sound stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice, soft, high-pitched, and impossibly familiar, whispered from the other side of the door. The last call. The rain poured relentlessly that night, a steady downpour that turned the city streets into rivers of glistening black. Jane was used to late shifts at the call center, but tonight felt different. There was an unsettling stillness in the office, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Most of the other operators had already gone home, leaving Jane alone in the dimly lit room, her desk bathed in the cold glow of a computer screen. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang. The sharp, sudden sound startled her, cutting through the monotony of the night. Jane sighed, adjusted her headset, and pressed the button to answer. 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, there was only static on the line. Jane frowned, glancing at the screen to check the caller ID, but it was blank. After a few seconds, a voice finally came through. A woman's voice, trembling and barely above a whisper. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you, Jane replied, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. What's your emergency? I don't know where I am, the woman said, her voice shaking. It's dark, and I'm so cold. Jane's fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to trace the call, but there was no location data. She frowned. That was odd. Can you describe your surroundings? Are you inside a building? Outside? There was a long pause before the woman responded. I think I'm in a room, but it's so dark I can't see anything. I don't know how I got here. Please, you have to help me. Jane's unease grew. Something about the call didn't feel right. Ma'am, I'm going to try to trace your call, but I need more information. Can you tell me your name? The line crackled with static, and for a moment, Jane thought she had lost the connection. But then the woman spoke again, her voice quieter, more distant. My name is Sarah. Please, hurry. Jane's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, running searches through the system. But nothing came up, no trace, no record of the number, no location. It was as if the call was coming from nowhere. Sarah, do you remember anything about how you got there? Jane asked, trying to keep the woman talking. Anything at all? I was driving, Sarah said slowly, as if struggling to recall. It was raining like tonight. I saw something in the road and I swerved. There was a crash and then nothing. I woke up here. Jane's heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she typed a quick search into the system, looking for recent accidents in the area. A few seconds later, a report popped up on her screen. A single car accident about 10 miles out of town. The car had skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. The driver, a woman in her 30s, had died on impact. The accident had occurred exactly 1 year ago to the day. Jane's blood ran cold as she read the report. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. This had to be a prank, some sick joke. But the fear in Sarah's voice had felt so real. Sarah, Jane said slowly, choosing her words carefully, can you tell me what time it is? There was another long pause, and Jane could hear Sarah breathing, quick and shallow. I don't know, I can't see a clock. Please, you have to help me. I'm so scared. Jane swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She glanced at the clock on her computer screen, 12:15 a.m. The accident report had been filed at 12:15 a.m. 1 year ago. Sarah, Jane said, her voice trembling slightly. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I think something happened to you a year ago. What do you mean? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now, filled with confusion and fear. You were in an accident, Jane continued, her words coming out in a rush. Your car crashed, and you didn't survive. There was a silence on the line, so deep and profound that Jane could hear her own heartbeat. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice so faint that Jane had to strain to hear. Am I dead? Jane didn't know how to respond. She had dealt with hundreds of calls during her career, but nothing like this. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the desk. I'm so cold, Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with the hollow resignation of someone realizing the impossible. I don't want to be alone. Tears welled up in Jane's eyes as she struggled to maintain her composure. You're not alone, she said softly, even though she knew how futile the words were. I'm here with you. The static on the line grew louder and Sarah's voice became more distant, as if she were slipping away. I can see lights in the distance. Maybe I can. The line went dead. Jane sat frozen in her chair, staring at the phone, willing it to ring again. But the office was silent, save for the distant sound of rain against the windows. She checked the call log, but there was no record of the call. No number, no trace. It was as if the call had never happened. Shaken, Jane sat there for a long time, trying to process what she had just experienced. Finally, she forced herself to take a deep breath and logged out of her computer. She needed to get out of there, needed to be anywhere but in that dark, empty office. As she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, the phone rang again. Jane froze, her hand on the doorknob. She knew she should just leave, but something compelled her to turn back. Slowly, she walked to her desk and picked up the receiver, her heart pounding in her chest. 911, what's your emergency? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice came through the line, faint and distant. Hello? Can you hear me? It was Sarah's voice. But this time, it wasn't trembling with fear. It was calm, almost serene. I just wanted to say, thank you. I'm not alone anymore. The line went dead once more, leaving Jane standing in the darkened office, her mind spinning. She slowly put the phone down, the reality of what had just happened settling over her like a shroud. With trembling hands, Jane turned off the lights and left the office. Tashtar, the man in the mirror. The storm had rolled in suddenly, a wall of dark clouds sweeping across the sky, bringing with it a torrent of rain and howling winds. Sophie was alone in her new apartment, an old Victorian building that had been converted into modern flats. The place was charming in a way, high ceilings, large windows, and vintage fixtures. But tonight, with the storm raging outside, it felt oppressive, almost claustrophobic. Sophie had moved in only a week ago, and despite the charm of the place, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her since she arrived, the feeling that she was being watched. It was irrational, she knew that, but it persisted nonetheless. Every time she passed the large antique mirror in the hallway, she felt as though someone was standing just out of view, watching her from the other side. Tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. She tried to distract herself with a movie, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea. But the storm grew louder, the wind rattling the windows, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. She kept glancing toward the hallway, where the mirror hung, almost expecting to see someone standing there, reflected in the glass. But each time she looked, it was just the empty hallway staring back at her. Unable to take it any longer, Sophie decided to cover the mirror. She grabbed a sheet from the linen closet and walked toward the hallway. As she approached the mirror, she could feel her pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. The reflective surface gleamed faintly in the dim light, and for a moment she hesitated, her own reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale. "It's just a mirror," she told herself. "You're being ridiculous." But as she lifted the sheet to cover it, something caught her eye. Movement in the reflection just behind her. Sophie spun around, but the hallway was empty. Heart pounding, she turned back to the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection was the same, showing the hallway exactly as it was. But then she saw it again, a flicker of movement, so quick she almost missed it. This time she kept her eyes on the mirror, and slowly a figure began to take shape in the glass. It was a man, standing at the far end of the hallway, his features obscured by shadow. He was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a pale face that seemed to almost glow in the dim light. His eyes were dark, hollow, and fixed directly on her. Sophie's blood ran cold. She turned again, her gaze darting down the hallway, but it was still empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the man was closer, his face now clearer, twisted into a menacing grin. Her hands shook as she gripped the sheet, fighting the urge to scream. She didn't know what to do. This couldn't be real. Mirrors didn't do this. People didn't just appear out of nowhere. But the man was there, inching closer with every heartbeat, his grin widening as if he knew something she didn't. Finally, Sophie forced herself to move. She threw the sheet over the mirror, her hands trembling so violently that she nearly dropped it. The fabric fell over the glass, blocking the reflection, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. For a moment, there was silence. The storm outside seemed to quiet. The wind no longer howling, but merely whispering against the windows. Sophie stood frozen, waiting, listening, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but nothing happened. "It's over," she told herself. "It was just a trick of the light, or your mind playing tricks on you." But deep down, she didn't believe it. She could still feel the man's presence, could still see his dark, hollow eyes in her mind. Unnerved, Sophie decided to leave the hallway and retreat to her bedroom. As she turned to go, she heard a soft rustling behind her, like fabric sliding against wood. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. The sheet had slipped off, crumpling to the floor. The mirror was uncovered again, its surface gleaming ominously in the dim light. And the man was still there, closer than ever, his face now filling the entire reflection, his grin twisted and malevolent. But there was something new in his expression. Anticipation. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The man wasn't just a reflection. He was coming through. She took a step back, her mind racing. She had to get out, had to leave the apartment, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in fear. The man in the mirror raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. She could see it now, the faint outline of his palm as if he were testing the barrier between them. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he began to push. The glass rippled like water, distorting his features, but he kept pushing, his grin widening as his hand began to emerge from the mirror, reaching out into the real world. Sophie's paralysis broke. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the floor as she sprinted down the hallway. Behind her, she could hear the faint sound of glass cracking, the whisper of a laugh that sent chills down her spine. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock in her panic. The laughter grew louder, closer, and she could feel the cold air around her, as if the man were right behind her, his presence pressing down on her like a weight. Finally, she yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway of the building, slamming the door behind her. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold rain pelting her face as she burst onto the street. The storm had intensified again, the wind whipping her hair around her face, but she didn't care. She kept running, putting as much distance between herself and that apartment as possible. It was hours before she stopped, finding herself in a small diner on the outskirts of town, drenched and trembling. She called a friend, explaining through chattering teeth that she needed a place to stay, too shaken to go back to her apartment. The next morning, Sophie returned to the building with a police officer, her heart pounding as they approached the door to her apartment. She had half expected it to be locked from the inside, or for something impossible to greet her when she opened it. But the door swung open easily, and the apartment was just as she had left it. Except for the mirror. It was shattered, the glass scattered across the floor in 1,000 jagged pieces. The frame hung crookedly on the wall, the sheet she had tried to cover it with lying untouched on the floor. But the worst part was the handprint, clear as day, pressed into the center of the shattered glass, as if someone had pushed their way through from the other side. The police officer tried to comfort her, saying it was just an old mirror that had finally broken under its own weight. But Sophie knew better. She never returned to that apartment. She moved in with her friend for a while, and then found a new place, far away from that building, that mirror, and the man who had tried to come through. But every time she caught her reflection in a mirror, she felt a prickling at the back of her neck, a sensation like cold fingers brushing her skin. She never lingered in front of mirrors anymore, always quick to Hasher, the forgotten room. The storm had raged all day, drenching the small town of Elmswood in a relentless downpour. The once bustling streets had turned into rivers, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them like straw. Sarah Lane, an aspiring historian and recent graduate, had just moved into her late aunt's Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The house was a grand old structure full of creaking floorboards and hidden corners, and Sarah had been excited to explore its many rooms and secrets. The house had been in Sarah's family for generations, but she had never spent much time there. Her aunt had been a reclusive woman, and the house had fallen into disrepair after her passing. Sarah had taken on the task of sorting through her aunt's belongings and restoring the house, seeing it as an opportunity to connect with her family's past. That evening, as the storm showed no sign of letting up, Sarah decided to tackle the attic. It was a place she had avoided so far, having heard unsettling stories about it from her aunt's old friends. But tonight, she was determined to uncover any hidden treasures or secrets the attic might hold. The staircase leading up to the attic was narrow and steep, with wooden steps that groaned under her weight. She turned on her flashlight and pushed open the attic door, which protested with a loud creak. The attic was dimly lit by the weak beam of her flashlight, revealing an assortment of old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. Sarah began rummaging through the boxes, finding old photographs, yellowed letters, and various trinkets from a bygone era. Most of it was mundane, but she was captivated by a particularly ornate box covered in intricate carvings. She carefully opened it, revealing a collection of old journals, each bound in worn leather. Her excitement grew as she leafed through the journals, discovering handwritten accounts of her ancestors, their daily lives, and the history of the house. One journal, however, stood out. It was bound in a dark green leather with an intricate brass lock, and it seemed much older than the others. Sarah's curiosity was piqued. She found a small key in one of the drawers and tried it on the lock. To her surprise, it worked. The journal opened with a satisfying creak, just revealing pages filled with neat, elegant handwriting. The entries detailed the life of Sarah's great-great-grandfather, Charles Lane, who had built the house. But as Sarah read on, the entries grew darker. Charles wrote about a hidden room that he had constructed within the house. It was a room that he had vowed to never enter, claiming it was cursed or haunted. He described strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, a cold presence, and unsettling dreams. One entry, dated just before Charles's death, was particularly chilling. "I have heard the whispers again tonight. They speak of things best left forgotten. I fear I am no longer safe in this house. The hidden room calls to me, and I must resist. If you find this journal, do not seek the room. It is a place where the past and the present blur, and one should not meddle with what lies within. Sarah's pulse quickened. The idea of a hidden room in the house fascinated her, but also filled her with a sense of dread. Her curiosity overpowered her fear, and she resolved to find this room. She had to know what Charles had feared so much. She spent hours searching the attic, examining every nook and cranny. She eventually found a peculiar section of the wall that seemed slightly different from the rest. There was a faint seam, almost imperceptible. Her heart raced as she pressed her hands against the wall, and with a little force, the section gave way, revealing a narrow passage. The passage was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. She took a deep breath, her flashlight illuminating the way as she crawled forward. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the passage, and the whispers started, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo from all directions. Finally, the passage opened into a small room, barely big enough to fit a single person. The walls were lined with strange symbols and eerie drawings. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest covered in dust. Sarah approached the chest cautiously, her flashlight casting unsettling shadows across the room. She hesitated for a moment before opening the chest. Inside, she found old, faded documents, but also something else, an old, cracked mirror, its surface obscured by grime. There was a note taped to the mirror. To anyone who finds this, I tried to warn you. The mirror holds what should not be seen. It reflects not just what is, but what was and what will be. The room is a conduit, a bridge between worlds. I can no longer resist the pull. You must leave now, before it is too late. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the note. Her curiosity turned to dread. She reached out to touch the mirror, feeling an icy chill seep into her fingers. As she cleaned the mirror, her reflection slowly emerged from the grime. But then, as the mirror cleared, her reflection began to change. The face staring back at her was not her own, but that of a woman she had never seen before. The woman's eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of torment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the woman in the mirror began to move independently of her own actions, her mouth forming silent words. In a panic, Sarah turned away from the mirror, but the whispers grew louder, the shadows in the room closing in around her. She felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder, and when she turned, there was no one there. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. Desperate to escape, Sarah scrambled back through the passage, the whispers following her, growing louder and more insistent. The passage felt like it was closing in on her, and the chill was now a biting cold that made her shiver uncontrollably. Finally, she emerged back into the attic, the passage sealing itself behind her with a soft thud. She ran down the stairs, not stopping until she was outside in the storm. The rain lashed at her face as she stumbled away from the house, not daring to look back. The next day, Sarah contacted a local historian to learn more about the hidden room and its origins. To her dismay, she discovered that the room was a part of an old ritualistic practice, a place where people believed they could glimpse into other worlds or communicate with the dead. The mirror was said to be a focal point for such activities, a portal to the unknown. Sarah never returned to the house. She sold it and moved far away, but the memory of that night stayed with her. She often wondered about the woman in the mirror, about the echoing house. The small town of Graymore had always been shrouded in an air of mystery, thanks to its old, abandoned homes and overgrown cemeteries. Among the many derelict buildings stood the Harper House, a sprawling, once grand estate that had fallen into ruin decades ago. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, telling tales of strange noises and ghostly apparitions. Most avoided it entirely, but for Lily Thompson, it was a challenge she couldn't resist. Lily was a local journalist known for her tenacity and curiosity. When she heard about the Harper House, she saw it as the perfect opportunity for an article that could boost her career. Despite the warnings from townsfolk, she decided to explore the house herself, determined to uncover the truth behind the eerie legends. One stormy evening, Lily drove up the long, winding road that led to the Harper House. The rain pelted her car like nails, and the wind howled through the trees, making the journey seem endless. When she finally arrived, she parked her car and stepped out into the torrential downpour, her flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The Harper house loomed before her, its dark silhouette barely visible through the rain. The once majestic mansion was now a shadow of its former self, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. As Lily approached, she noticed an old iron gate creaking on its hinges, and she pushed through, wincing at the rusted groan. With a deep breath, she approached the front door, which hung ajar as if inviting her in. She pushed it open with a loud creak and stepped inside, her flashlight revealing a grand foyer covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was musty and stale, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. Lily began her investigation in the main hallway, taking notes and snapping photos. The house was as dilapidated as she had imagined, with peeling wallpaper, broken chandeliers, and decaying furniture. But as she moved through the room, she began to notice something peculiar, an unsettling feeling that she was not alone. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, but then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She stopped, straining to listen, but the sound abruptly ceased. Lily's heart raced, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. She made her way to the second floor, where the thumping grew louder, accompanied by a low, mournful wail. The sound seemed to come from one of the bedrooms. With a mixture of fear and excitement, Lily approached the door, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. As she opened the door, she was greeted by an empty room, its walls lined with faded portraits of the Harper family. The sound had stopped, and Lily felt a chill creep up her spine. She was about to turn away when she noticed something unusual, a large, ornate mirror leaning against the wall, covered in dust. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, Lily approached the mirror and wiped away the grime. The glass revealed an intricate frame and a reflection of the empty room. But as she continued to clean, the reflection began to change. The room in the mirror was no longer empty. It was filled with people, family members dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing in the exact same positions as the portraits on the wall. Lily blinked, unsure if she was seeing things, but the people in the mirror moved, their eyes following her as if they were alive. A shiver ran down her spine as she noticed that the mirror's reflection didn't quite match the room. The people were not just standing, they were reaching out, their hands pressed against the glass as if trying to escape. The thumping noise returned, louder and more urgent, as if something was trying to break through. Lily backed away from the mirror, her flashlight flickering. The wailing grew louder, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of despair. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. Lily fumbled with her flashlight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The thumping grew more frantic, and she could hear the scraping of something against the door. In a panic, Lily pounded on the door, trying to force it open, but it was no use. The door was stuck fast. The mirror's reflection seemed to pulse with a strange light, and Lily turned to see the figures inside moving more violently, their expressions twisted in anguish. Then, a voice spoke from the mirror, a soft, sorrowful whisper that seemed to come from all directions. "Help us! We are trapped!" Lily's blood ran cold. She had heard of ghost stories and haunted places, but this was different. The realization hit her with full force. The people in the mirror were not just reflections. They were trapped souls, eternally imprisoned in the glass. Desperate to escape, Lily grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The thumping and wailing stopped abruptly and the air grew still and heavy. Lily collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. When the dust settled, she slowly stood up, the broken mirror lying in shards around her. The door creaked open, and she stumbled out into the hallway, her hands shaking. She left the house in a daze, not stopping until she was back in her car, the rain still pouring down. As she drove away from the Harper house, she glanced in her rearview mirror. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadowy figure standing in the window, watching her as she left. The next morning, the town was abuzz with news. The Harper house had caught fire during the night, and the flames had consumed the entire structure. Lily knew better than to return, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of the house. In the weeks that followed, Lily received strange phone calls, disturbing, echoing voices that seemed to come from nowhere. She started seeing shadows moving out of the corner of her eye and hearing whispers in the dead of night. She never wrote the article she had planned. Instead, she left Graymore, unable to escape the haunting memories of the Harper house and its trapped souls. And sometimes, when she looked in a mirror, she could still see the faint outlines of those anguished faces, trapped in the glass, forever echoing their plea for help.